ahead and open the chat at the bottom of your screen and let us know where you're viewing from.
Well, welcome. I'm excited all of you could be with us today. I'm the Executive Director for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and this is the last of our 4-part series on grasslands. We really appreciate the collaborative spirit and support of our partners who made the forum possible, including Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and the Science Policy Institute, as well as Colorado State University with both the Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Salazar Center. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute Nations. So hopefully many of you have been with us on this journey and you've been tuning in for this 4-part series. And we've had a wonderful slate of speakers. We've taken you from the science of grasslands and the importance of grazing to land health. We've also talked about communities and people of grasslands, including ranchers and indigenous, and our connections to the land, the importance of ecological health in our cultures. And next, we highlighted what is possible when people and partners come together and to conserve our grasslands landscape, wildlife, and communities, showing an example in Larimer County in the city of Fort Collins. If you missed any of these, please go to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and the Science and Policy Institute to check them out. Today, though, we're excited to talk to you about the future of our grassland landscapes, their importance for climate resiliency, wildlife, and local communities, including indigenous and ranchers. We're honored today to have Clint Evans with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, our state conservationist for Colorado, Marshall Johnson, our Chief Conservation Officer for the National Audubon, and Kelsey Scott, Director of Programs for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. So let's get to know our guests. We're going to start off with Kelsey. Can you share a little bit more about yourself, including the Intertribal Agriculture Council and your history and work?
Ampeti washte tatea akwalui Lakotia imachiapi na Kelsey Scott washichie imachiapi. Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My Lakota name is Soft Little Breeze Woman, and my English name is Kelsey Scott. I am the Director of Programs for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. We are a national nonprofit organization headquartered out of Billings, Montana, but with staff remote placed all across the country in the lower 48 and including Alaska. We were chartered in 1987 through an act of Congress that actually was established by way of a group of tribal leaders coming together and reaching out to Congress in DC to indicate that there has been a drastic need in the midst of the farm financial crisis of the 80s and a series of natural disasters that compounded that impact across the Great West for some disaster assistance programming that is a little more specific and tailored and better reaching into Indian country. Congress's response was, well, why does Indian country need more? And they petitioned or, assigned the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs to pursue some research in this area. And the report findings was that there had been a historical underservice to Indian country and Indian producers and tribal and trust allotted lands that prohibited accessing USDA programs, which would have established conservation infrastructure and equitable access to credit in a way that would have made producers more likely to withstand the crises they faced. During the farm financial crisis, American Indian farmers and ranchers were 5 times more likely to be foreclosed on than the national average. Since that time, we have been growing and developing and expanding in a variety of ways. We now have a number of programs that serve the various needs of our stakeholders all across Indian country. Kind of the bread and butter of the work that we do is we meet producers, tribal leaders, tribal entities, tribal businesses where they're at. We work to understand their goals, and then we follow them along every step of the way, providing the technical assistance and resource support that they may need to pursue those goals. We remain knowledgeable in what United States Department of Agricultural programs may be available to support in pursuing some of those goals. But we also are aware of the fact that often, a lot of times, we need to be in the room to help to translate the Indigenous scoping behind our goals so that USDA accurately and adequately understands what exactly it is that we're working to accomplish as Indigenous land stewards. In addition to our technical assistance work, we provide marketing and market access design support for not only domestic trade opportunities, but international for our made and produced by American Indian Foods products. We also prioritize outreach to the young professionals that are going to be the next generation stepping into this work. So beginning farmer rancher outreach, as well as professional development and leadership development opportunities, are pretty high on our list of priorities that we take into consideration in all of the programming that we do. And we have our regenerative economies and our regenerative agricultural programming, which really works to tell the story of the fact that you cannot have a regenerative system without a regenerative finance model that supports the system. And we need to really step back, learn from nature, learn from our Indigenous ways of being with nature, and start to think through that living systems framework as we redefine what financial systems that are supposed to be supporting agriculture look like, and redefining what conservation structures that are supposed to be supporting agriculture might look like, and how do we work in tandem with the land, with the people, with the animals in a way that starts to rebuild some of that asset that we have there in just the connectivity, the deep connections that we have with people and the landscape. One final leg of work that we engage in that is incredibly important to the space of where we're visiting today is the Intertribal Agriculture Council and our partner organization, the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, help to co-lead the Native Farm Bill Coalition. In the 2018 Farm Bill, the Native Farm Bill Coalition was successful in ensuring 63 provisions were folded in, tribal specific provisions were folded into the 2018 Farm Bill, which truly was monumental in success in helping to convey the message of the importance of ensuring adequate access to resources through the Farm Bill implementation. So we're really excited about all of the work that we get to do on the landscape, promoting tribal land stewards, engaging with partners, helping to tell the story. And it really is a privilege for me to be able to be here today. I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I really appreciated learning more about the purpose of the Intertribal Ag Council and all your work and efforts. I'm going to now have you introduce Marshall Johnson. If you would please share a little bit on your connections with Grasslands and working on the land.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Tammy. This is really enjoyable for me. I spent about 13 years working with our Audubon Dakota's regional office, and now stepping into my role as the Chief Conservation Officer for the National Audubon Society. It's sort of all of the landscapes and ecosystems on my plate and working with my team. So it's always really enjoyable to get back to Grasslands, and Grasslands will always have a really special place in my heart. And it's one of the most critical, if not the most critical ecosystem that we need more awareness, more energy, and more focus on. A little bit about Audubon. We are a collection of 450 chapters, 30 plus nature centers, 20 state and regional offices, and an international program that now has a footprint from the boreal forest of Canada to Colombia and a number of Latin American countries, and even South American countries as well, Bahamas, et cetera, et cetera. We really follow birds and the needs of birds. If I were to sum up our mission in the most succinct way, it's really breaks down into two things: joy and action, bringing people to the joy of birds and taking action, whether it's advocacy, education, policy, or on the ground conservation work. It really boils down to the joy of birds and the action to protect and sustain bird populations across the Western Hemisphere. And obviously we do that and really couldn't meet our mission without doing it in partnership with organizations like Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and so many others, including NRCS, USDA, and many others. Again, really looking forward to the conversation today about a topic that I'm really passionate about, and that's grassland conservation.
Thank you so much, Marshall. Really appreciate that broader perspective on Audubon. And Clint, can you share a little bit on your history and work out on the landscape?
Yeah, good afternoon, Tammy, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I've worked 22 years for the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. I had the opportunity to start my career in my home state of Kansas. And then since that time, I've worked full-time permanent positions in Idaho, as well as have served as a state conservationist here in Colorado for the past 7 years. During my career, I've had opportunities to work in Ohio, Wyoming, Utah, and Texas, as well as currently on detail in Washington, D.C., serving as the acting deputy chief for programs for NRCS nationwide. So the NRCS, we just celebrated our 87th birthday on April 27th of 2022. The agency originally started as a soil erosion service and then later became the Soil Conservation Service. And then around 1995, became the Natural Resources Conservation Service in order to broaden the agency's title to match the mission and the technical assistance and the programs that we deliver to private landowners and farmers and ranchers and American Indian tribal members all across the nation. And really our primary thing is provide conservation technical assistance through conservation planning. And then that planning supports the implementation of our Farm Bill programs that provide financial assistance and voluntary incentive payments to help agricultural producers all across the country adopt conservation practices to improve their farms and ranches and the natural resources that they're responsible for and stewards of every day. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you all, Tammy, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thanks. As you can see, we have a great slate of speakers here again today. And I was hoping, since we're talking about grassland, let's get a little deeper on grassland. So Kelsey, can you share more about your connections with grasslands, including opportunities and needs on tribal lands?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. One thing I didn't share in my introduction is I am based on the Cheyenne River Sioux Indian Reservation, which is right in the heart of the Northern Great Plains grasslands. My family is a cow-calf ranching operation. We also own a direct-to-consumer grass-finished beef operation. So not only on the professional scope do I get to work in the space of grasslands and promoting conservation of grasslands, but on a personal scope, I also believe very passionately in revitalizing, repairing, and protecting our grasslands. I think that one of the topics I'd like to really bring up right out the gate is that, Indigenous practices in management of our grasslands really helped to shape and to form the ecosystems that we now have come to appreciate as our grasslands. All across Indian country, present day Indian country, there is a very prominent existence of this Indigenous way of stewarding the land still. We have producers that are very knowledgeable of being wonderful graziers. They know that they must work in harmony with all that the nature provides them, all that the natural systems of the grasslands provide them, in addition to really just having that philosophical belief in wanting to promote the landscape to rehabilitate our grasslands and to preserve our grasslands, there are also various regulatory agencies at play between our tribal land offices, our individual grazing associations of tribal lands, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And these regulatory agencies have really been strong partners, continuing to be stronger partners, maybe I should say, in ensuring that the preservation of our grasslands takes place and that we do have a landscape on Indian country that maintains the integrity of what our grasslands offer to the grander ecosystems. I think that if we're talking about priorities on tribal lands, it's first and foremost really starting to recognize the role that Indigenous land stewards have brought into the scope of helping to maintain grasslands over the long periods of time, but also in the more recent. We still see grasslands on our Indian reservations. We still see the non-tilled lands. We still see untouched rangeland that has been preserved. And we really need to call out and appreciate what our native land stewards have done to help to preserve those ecosystems. In addition, recognizing how we can be strong players in continuing to demonstrate what a functioning grassland ecosystem looks like, and recognizing that we're still doing this with a historical under access to programming that would support the continued design and fostering of our grasslands. And so what could that really look like if we channeled some of our resources, some of our energy, some of our awareness to Indian lands to really uplift them, not only as pilot demonstrations, but as comparisons. We can do fence line comparisons, we can do regional comparisons, and we can start to really learn more about our grassland species by starting to turn to some of that research that I think our Indian lands present a really, really unique laboratory for out there in the landscape. And then there's a lot that we have not surfaced, I don't think yet, in our Western science approach. There's so much traditional ecological knowledge that I think we really need to start visiting about in the context of being science and being recognized in science, and what can we learn from these indigenous practice systems to start to better inform some of our national policies around promoting grasslands, and how can we really start to revitalize that living system in a way that continues to build relationships with the humans and with the nature, both on our tribal lands and off our tribal lands.
Thank you, Kelsey. Really appreciate that added perspective and the importance on the traditional ecological knowledge as we work to have healthy grasslands for the future. Marshall, can you share a little bit more about Audubon and specific work with grasslands and communities?
Yes, absolutely. I became involved obviously with our regional office here in the Dakotas, and this is really the heart of our mission since 1970 and now. And we think of 1970 with Earth Day and all of the different activities as being almost the high water mark of conservation and conservation of the environment. And since 1970, we've lost 3 billion birds, and largely driven by habitat loss. And it's sort of irrefutable, the suite of species and the ecosystem that is under the most duress are grasslands and grassland birds. We've lost more than 53% of grassland birds since 1970. So obviously, this is a critical issue for a bird conservation organization like Audubon, and we've really redoubled our efforts here in the Northern Great Plains, the Rockies, and the Southern Great Plains as well, sort of the core habitat, the core central grasslands ecosystem. And we've really done that in a multitude of ways, obviously on policy and advocating for policies that support grassland conservation. Some of the ones, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Sagebrush Initiative, a lot of things that folks sort of know. But then we've all this passion and commitment to grasslands conservation has also brought us into policy realms that we aren't traditionally accustomed to. I remember a number of years ago now, the dietary guidelines were released, and for the first time, we're advocating for a reduction in red meat, sort of not really as from our standpoint, really taking in the opportunity around producing protein in a way that sustains grasslands. And so we weighed in with a number of groups in an area where we hadn't traditionally done. But it's really policy, market-based conservation, and providing and facilitating incentives to private landowners to improve the habitat, improve infrastructure, and just support technical assistance for landowners. The program that I will call out that I'm most excited about and have been most involved in is our bird-friendly beef conservation ranching initiative. And that's a certification market-based initiative aimed at obviously supporting better outcomes for grassland birds. But I think the critical element that we will need in preserving grasslands moving forward is connecting to the marketplace, connecting to people, and to population centers. One of the things that I think we have going against us in grasslands conservation, you look at sort of the United States, where in the places where the least amount of people live, it's sort of the same landscape as the grasslands. And so not a lot of people know what grasslands are. They've not been immersed in this landscape enough to appreciate the history of grasslands. And so by connecting grassland stewardship and the myriad ecosystem services and benefits, carbon sequestration, pollinator habitat, bird and other wildlife habitat, to the marketplace, the theory and the concept here is that we can reach people that we otherwise wouldn't reach. And I think whether it's Audubon's programs, other programs that are out there, that to me is the most important thing that we can do, is really connecting the stewardship and the management and the production of protein from the central grasslands to the marketplace and to urban centers. And that's an area where Audubon is really focused on, not only through our program, but in a myriad of different ways.
Thank you, Marshall, and thanks for highlighting the trajectory of our grassland birds and the needs that we're all trying to do to help reverse that, and the importance of grazing out on that landscape for our healthy grasslands. Clint, would you like to share a little bit more about NRCS and focus on grasslands as well?
Yeah, you bet, Tammy. Thank you. And, you know, the NRCS has been working, well, like I mentioned earlier, over the last 87 years with agricultural producers, starting with the Dust Bowl. You know, a lot of what the Soil Conservation Service did was reestablish land that had been converted to annual crop production back into native species and grasslands. And then over the last 87 years, we've provided a tremendous amount of conservation technical assistance to private landowners and operators to help them solve resource concerns, develop grazing systems that'll make their grasslands more sustainable and hopefully make their farms and ranches more profitable over the years as well. You know, starting with the 1996 Farm Bill is when the Environmental Quality Incentives Program first came into existence. And that helped bring a lot more financial assistance and voluntary incentive payments that are available to agricultural producers all across the country as well. And then in the 2002 Farm Bill, it started out in, I think 2004 was the first sign-up period for the Conservation Security Program. And then later in the 2008 Farm Bill, that shifted to what we now know today as the Conservation Stewardship Program, which also provides enhancement activity payments and technical assistance to farmers and ranchers and American Indian tribal members out there across the country to develop grazing systems, to develop infrastructure like livestock water supply pipelines and tanks and watering facilities, as well as wells and pumping plants to help get that water where they need it for those livestock. We've also worked over the last decade through the Working Lands for Wildlife efforts to develop what we now have as the sagebrush biome in the Western United States. in the Central Grasslands framework that runs through the central U.S. and covers those areas of grasslands. And what happened there was each of the Nrcs state conservationists and their local partners and staff worked together collaboratively to develop goals and priorities to implement into those frameworks. And that'll be NRCS's contributions towards this overall Central Grasslands roadmap effort to make sure that we're continuing to promote grasslands conservation. We're continuing to grow opportunities to provide technical assistance to producers and American Indian tribal members across the landscape to make sure that not only are we getting that youth education and information and outreach out there to help grow that next generation, but we're also able to provide that technical assistance to those private landowners and American Indian tribal members out there across the country where they're needing to make improvements or better manage their grazing lands all across the West and in the central prairie region here of the United States. You know, one of the biggest threats I think we see today is drought. You know, no matter where you are, there's a lot of different threats across the landscape. Could be conversion to cultivation, could be urban, suburban development like we see here in the Front Range of Colorado, as well as wildfires. But really, drought knows no boundaries. You know, drought is everywhere. It's going to hit at some point in time, especially with the changing climate. So I think the more we can work together through our conservation partners, like you and Marshall have both mentioned today, the NRCS works with soil and water conservation districts. There's over 3,000 soil and water conservation districts in the United States that help provide that technical assistance, help to identify those locally led resource concerns that we can then help address through our conservation programs and through our technical assistance in our field offices out there, you know, in the central United States and in the western United States and everywhere we have grasslands of importance. We've got boots on the ground, and we're helping expand that technical reach through our partnerships with various entities like Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, our conservation districts, Audubon, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, and many, many others. NIFWIF is another organization that we work with. The Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative, the NRCS will be awarding several agreements to help reboot the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative in a number of states, and Congress allocated funds here in 2022 to help us get that work done. So I think there's a lot more work to do, and I think there's a lot we can accomplish through that youth education and information outreach to get people involved. And as Marshall said, you know, we do have a big gap, an information gap in this country and an education gap to where that folks are separated from the land. You know, one of the things that has kept me passionate about conservation and about working in grasslands over the past 22 years of my federal career, and when I worked as a ranch hand in Northeast Oklahoma for about 5 years out of college, is that, you know, the people's connection to the land. When you talk to a farmer, rancher, or a tribal member who's out there managing livestock or managing that land, they have a deep, deep connection to the natural resources and that overall ecosystem that they live and work in every day. And I think one of the things that's going to make this sustainable over time is that they're passing down, you know, that passion and that energy and that information and knowledge. As Kelsey mentioned, there's a lot of indigenous knowledge out there and information that we in the NRCS and the USDA need to be more tapped into. We need to look at our conservation practice standards and specifications and work with folks like Kelsey and other American Indian tribal leaders to determine what do we need to change or modify within our practice standards and specifications to make sure that we can help promote those indigenous practices to help better manage and make these grasslands more sustainable into the future. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, Clint. It's great to see all the energy and elevation of grasslands as a priority. And this has been touched on a little bit, but now I just like our great speakers to talk a little bit about the fact that our grasslands are being lost to cultivation, urban development, energy production, and also they're being severely impacted by climate change. So what can we do to save our grasslands and address the growing demands that are being put on our grasslands? Kelsey, would you like to share a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the panelists here are all elevating some sort of importance about communication. I think that we have to enhance our messaging to our consumers, to our decision makers, but also to our colleagues. We unfortunately suffer from this desire to pit agriculture against agriculture in the industry. And I think that that doesn't help move anybody's dialogue forward. We need to figure out how to refrain from that pitting against one another and instead find ways to collaborate, establish that common ground, understand what our underlying drivers are as humans in this space of being involved with nature, and start to use that as building the bridge forward and starting to really uplift and embrace the fact that we are all out here on the land, caring for the land for one commonality. It's that deep connection that we have with the land and with the systems at play. I think that there's additional efforts that are already in existence that we can do a better job of championing and supporting and encouraging. Just with my team this week, we've been reflecting a little bit on how being in the nonprofit space, you really are in this unfortunate power dynamic with the funder and being the grantee and not being able to truly practice and explore and embody the principles and the theory of change in your own mission of work, because you are a victim to that mindset of scarcity, because it's always a constant reach to ensure that you are accessing the resources that you need to keep your team employed, to keep the messages going. And so figuring out how we can do a better job of supporting those organizations that are already in this space, whether that's through cooperative agreements or collaborative funding efforts, to help to uplift the connection that they already have with a very active stakeholder group, I think is really, really critical. If you're not already in the work of promoting grasslands, I'm not trying to deter you from promoting grassland preservation and enhancement. I'm just trying to inspire you to reach out to the organizations that are already involved in that space and find ways to learn from them, find ways to collaborate with them. And I think that that messaging is going to help to inform on a larger scale. It's going to ensure that we're not continuing to compete against one another for the very limited resources that are out there. And largely, it's going to help us come together through that common ground lens. We're going to be able to inform with more concise messaging so that the consumers, the stakeholders, and our decision makers, who we really need to be able to influence, are not being burnt out with this variety and mirage of messaging that they just can't ever quite get down to the bottom of.
Thank you, Kelsey. I really appreciate that collaborative spirit and us working together and really focusing on the common ground. Marshall, did you want to add any additional perspectives or thoughts?
I really appreciated all that Kelsey had to share. I would underscore that and just add, it's been said, anyone can love the mountains and forests, but it takes soul to love the prairie. And there's a subtleness and a intimacy that you sort of have to be close to it. And Clint spoke to it really eloquently, this disconnect that is pervasive even in environmental conservation. And we have to really bring forward a new understanding of how important grasslands are and really mainstreaming grassland conservation in the way that other ecosystems have experienced. And I think that touches on and connects to something Kelsey mentioned around communications and getting the message out. I think that's really important. And as we get the message out and more people are aware of what's happening, which is, a ecosystem loss and destruction that in some years outpaces what's happening in the Amazon rainforest. Often years outpaces the scale and scope of what's happening. We have to protect our Amazon rainforest, and we equally have to protect our grassland ecosystem. And when we raise awareness, I think that can be the wind in the sails of change that's going to be necessary in public policy. As we go through this year and in subsequent years, I think that the North American Grasslands Conservation Act, that's a really important tool that can be used for advancing grasslands conservation in a way that we've had a lot of success around wetland conservation in the North American Wetland Conservation Act. And so there's a lot of discussions to be had, a lot of negotiations to be had. But if you care about grasslands, and as this discussion starts to pick up pace here around the North American Grasslands Conservation Act, I implore you to really be engaged and lend your voice and your support to vehicles such as that can really make a difference and make a change here moving forward, as well as bills like Farm Bill. I think more and more we are getting more acclimated and aware to how important the Farm Bill is to setting policies that either can drive a accelerated grassland loss situation, or really bring grassland and grass-based agriculture in more parity with other commodities. And I think that's sort of fundamental in all of this, and really supporting voluntary conservation practices out on the landscape. I think that I see you speak with landowners, and there's such support for voluntary programs like easements and other things, and then those programs are sort of called into question. There's a lot of support among landowners for voluntary conservation, and we have to, I think, really continue to raise that as an issue. But I'm optimistic, if you can believe it, because of what's happening again with the North American Grasslands Conservation Act and the partners that have assembled around supporting that. Farm Bill is always an opportunity for us to renew our commitment to grass-based agriculture and really leveling the playing field. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act. There are a lot of things that are in motion because we've become more aware of grassland loss in the grassland ecosystem, and we've got a ways to go. So number one is really raising that awareness and rolling up our sleeves collectively and being in the discussion at the table, in the arena, when these really big, important pieces of legislation are moving forward over the next weeks and months and years. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to save the grasslands yet.
Thanks, Marshall. Thanks for highlighting a lot of the great opportunities and resources that are hopefully coming online to even bolster our funding and capacity for grasslands, and just highlighting how beautiful they are. And if you haven't got out to explore your grasslands, get out there. It's quite magical. Clint, a few words you'd like to add before I go on to another question?
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. And I mentioned it earlier in my, really the areas the major threats to our land, about what we talk about, the encroachment of woody species in certain parts of the country that is a major concern, as well as energy development. Here in eastern Colorado, we're seeing more and more solar farms being put in out here in the eastern plains in our grasslands, and it takes up a significant amount of habitat, and it takes a significant amount of land out of production. And so while we want to support green energy, we need to find a balance for how do the wind farms fit into the landscape, how do the solar farms fit into the overall landscape. But more importantly, when we talk about preservation of our grasslands and how are we going to be able to make that sustainable in the future, or even improve what we have now and stop that decline that we're seeing in a lot of areas with loss of certain bird species and other wildlife species. I really deep down from back in my experience as a district conservationist in central Kansas, a lot of it was about youth education and outreach. So if we can get the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders out there on the landscape doing demonstration days and field days, they go home, tell their parents about it. And then if we promote more things like the Mountain Plover Festival that was out in Carville, Colorado this past weekend, those are great opportunities to draw people out of the city and out of these urban suburban environments and teach them and educate them about the importance of grassland birds and the importance of that overall grassland ecology, and why agriculture is important, why these indigenous practices are important to manage and maintain these ecosystems. And then from an NRCS perspective, when we talk about conservation technical assistance and planning, really getting partners involved, getting local communities involved, and looking at an overall landscape scale or watershed plan is going to be extremely critical. One, to get more than just the everyday farmer and rancher and folks that are out there managing the lands. We need to reach those folks within these communities that are a part of that landscape and a part of these overall ecosystems, but get them engaged so that they understand why the importance of the grasslands, how it affects things like water quality and air quality and soil erosion, and then also our wildlife habitat. And then lastly, Tammy, I might just add, I think another important aspect for us as we look at management and sustainability of our grasslands is there is a significant amount of cultivated land across this landscape. And for me personally, I had some great experiences in Kingman County, Kansas, where we developed a huge conservation buffers program through continuous CRP. And one of the things we can do is we can stop that fence row to fence row farming that occurs, and we can create conservation buffers and create habitat linkage between large tracts of native grasslands across that cultivated landscape, to where that our various wildlife species and things have a way to move across the landscape, areas to nest and do brood rearing and things like that. So I really think if we focus on that whole landscape and how we can have that habitat connectivity and overall sustainability of those grasslands, I think will improve. But really, in my heart, I believe it goes down to that information education with the youth and our folks in our communities that are also part of these ecosystems. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. And yeah, it's really important that our youth know about the landscapes they live in and how they can help contribute to their conservation for the future. Seeing a lot of different questions coming in on the chat. So I was gonna ask our panelists here to talk a little bit about, grasslands evolved with disturbance. The dynamic system, grazing and fire have been very critical. So this has been touched on a little bit, but how do we integrate Western science, local knowledge, indigenous traditional ecological knowledge to help with the integrity, as well as honor our cultural values and the healthy populations of wildlife? Kelsey, do you want to start off with a reaction to that?
I would love to, thank you. Well, I think first and foremost, we have to remember that these disturbances weren't all of the time random acts of nature. Most of the time, they were inspired and led by the people on the land. And so we have to recognize that often the word disturbance has this very negative connotation associated with it. And it's not. It is absolutely an essential component of every aspect of our life. From the alarm clock disturbing us from our sleep in the morning to the systems that roll across the Great Plains, nature craves disturbance, and nature actually relies upon disturbance to happen so that the regrowth can take place, and so that the communities can become more resilient and more resistant to these shifts that we are seeing in our climate, and we're going to continue to see. And so we have to really embrace that disturbance is not a negative thing. Disturbance is a tool. It is an essential component that we need to be able to utilize. But that disturbance isn't just something that is impacting what is above ground. The disturbance, and many of our indigenous knowledge bases, practice this awareness of disturbance being associated with what's below the ground. It is in our soil microbiome that we are building a wealth of asset in a resistant and resilient energy source, food source, nutrient source, and really just wealth of organisms that can contribute to the growth of our grasses, which then in turn will nourish a healthier wildlife population, a healthier human population, and so on throughout the food web. So it's really, I think it starts with recognizing that there should be a positive association with disturbance, and remembering that the disturbance does not just happen with what is visible to us above ground. It has a direct correlation with what is going on below ground as well.
Thank you, Kelsey. Really appreciate that. Marshall?
I think Kelsey really provided a great overview and spoke eloquently on it. I don't have much to add other than I think it's really important where we can. Some of all of our grasslands are evolved with fire. Some more than others. The eastern tallgrass prairie is highly in need of fire on shorter intervals than other systems to thrive and survive. And so I think more, again, getting back to nuts and bolts, private landowners really need that support, those incentives to be able to incorporate something like prescribed fire into the management of their farms and ranches. And we know that fire has to be a part of these systems. So I firmly support wherever we can incorporating more disturbance as a part of our management of our grasslands.
Thank you so much, Marshall. Clint, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just right quick, I know both Kelsey and Marshall mentioned, the importance of fire out there on the landscape. In the Flint Hills of eastern Kansas is one of the, and also in northeastern Oklahoma are one of the few areas where prescribed fire is part of the culture in ranching in order to keep the woody species at bay and maintain those tallgrass prairies that are so important to those rural economies and to that overall ecosystem. But the other thing I would say when we start talking about disturbance, it's the use of livestock and even bison, and a lot of the prescribed grazing systems, and you'll hear various terms from rotational grazing to mob grazing to different terms that are used out there to talk about that early time intensive grazing to where that you allow for rest, but you bring that livestock in there to create that disturbance. And much like the native bison had done back throughout history, they grazed in large herds, but they moved on. They didn't stay in one place for long periods of time. And I think we're seeing more and more livestock producers out there across the landscape utilize their livestock in a way that helps create that disturbance and then provides that rest within that overall growing season and throughout that given calendar year through the various seasons to allow those grasses and forbs and legumes to recover and be a healthy, productive ecosystem that'll support the wildlife and the natural resources that they're trying to manage. So not only is fire important management activity, but also those prescribed grazing activities and how we manage that disturbance with livestock is so important to that overall health of those grassland ecosystems. And the proof is in the pudding, right? When we look at our conservation reserve program acres out there across the landscape, while they've done a great job of helping control erosion and create some habitat, if those lands aren't disturbed by either fire or mowing or some light tillage or using livestock to create that disturbance, those stands become very decadent and just they start to actually go into decline rather than having a positive ecological trend. You actually start to see them go into a negative trend because they don't have some form of disturbance out there on the landscape. And fire and livestock are two very important management tools that we as land managers and stewards of the land can utilize to improve that overall ecosystem.
Thank you, Clint. I'm going to just open this up for whoever wants to chime in first, but obviously our grassland landscape is being used for different purposes, from growing crops to raising cattle to supporting our rural communities and cultures. Where is that balance? How can we support a more viable grass-based economy? And also recognizing that there's renewable energy coming out there as well as crops being grown. Does anybody want to jump in on that question and help think about how we can still have healthy grasslands for the future?
Sure, I'll jump in and then turn it over to Marshall and Kelsey for what they'd like to add. In my mind, I mentioned it earlier, that overall landscape scale planning and getting that community engagement through information, education, and outreach activities and things like Mountain Clover Festival to get people out there on the land. I think when we get our communities involved and the folks that are in the surrounding communities to these landscapes, where they have that knowledge and awareness of why it's important and what it takes to manage and steward that land. I think that's going to help us not only promote the preservation of grasslands, but also their continued sustainability. Because if we can get people engaged, and if we can look at that overall landscape and develop an overall plan, working with ag producers and indigenous tribal members that are out there managing livestock and bison herds across the landscape, I think we need that engagement, and we need to have that broader plan rather than a farm by farm or ranch by ranch plan. We need to look at that whole watershed and that whole ecological system in that landscape. And as I mentioned earlier, the importance of also looking at that cultivated land to see how does it fit, how does it contribute, how could it also help make those overall ecosystems healthy and sustainable for future generations.
Thank you, Clint. Marshall, did you want to add?
Yeah, really quickly. Thanks a lot, Clint. And I see Roger Gates had a question. You know, our conservation ranching initiative has enrolled just under 4 million acres across the grasslands, and we've really engaged our nearly 2 million members, and there's a lot of support for ecologically sensitive grazing and beef production. Not everyone's going to agree on anything, but our members are very supportive of that. So I just wanted to speak to that question in the chat. Also, you know, on just to sort of, because there's a lot of awareness, and I don't want to sort of draw a false dichotomy or anything between forest and grasslands. But for perspective, I think there's a lot of awareness. You know, you watch the Oscars, the Amazon rainforest come up, and you know, everyone knows about the rainforest, and we have to protect the rainforest. It's very important. There's about 17% of the historic Amazonian rainforest has been lost. About 55% of the grassland ecosystem has been lost. And if you go into ecosystems like our ecoregions, like the Eastern Tallgrass Prairie, north of 90% of the Eastern Tallgrass Prairie has been lost. I think we are getting, and I would say we've blown past a point where we have to do all that we can to not only preserve what's left, but to put more back on the landscape. And it really, that I think comes from communication, and we do quite a bit of that, and really understanding, you know, we hear a lot about land use with cattle and grasslands and other large herbivores out on the landscape. And, you know, should we be using this much land for cattle production? Well, you know, in terms of land use, the cattle are there, but the birds are there, and the pollinators are there, and the carbon is there, and the water filtration is there. So I think we have to be a little bit more nuanced nationally in how we talk about environmental conservation and the importance of grasslands. We have to secure a clean energy future. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, I've been in rooms where I've had, you know, this is not the norm. This is, I suspect, and I think it is an exception to the rule, but I've been in rooms where wind developers sort of say, well, we're focused on the wastelands, not the productive cropland, but we're going to put the project in the wastelands, the grasslands. Well, we can't have that perspective. We have to have a more sensitive perspective on energy development. And, you know, Audubon, we fully support responsible clean energy siting, always have. But it's really important that we understand it's not just the conversion of grasslands and energy development. It's that energy development can cause displacement with grassland birds. So, yeah, I think the grasslands have given enough. And so I think we have to find a balance here. But you know, this ecosystem is on the brink, and I think has done enough, given enough, yielded quite a bit. And so as grassland birds are lost, there's a way of life here for ranchers that are also imperiled by further grassland loss. So absolutely, we have to find a balance, but I sort of lean towards we have to do everything we can to keep every blade on the landscape. Obviously, we're going to lose some, we're going to gain some, but that's, I guess, my perspective on it.
Thank you so much, Marshall. Kelsey, what would you like to add?
Yeah, what tremendous send-off messages, but I'll play off of what they had to say. And I think that not only have our grasslands given enough, I think our producers have too. I don't know a single producer that genuinely wants to harm their lands. And if they are harming their landscape, it is largely as a result of some form of economic stress that they are under. And so I think that we really do need to address this preservation of our grasslands as a holistic approach. We need to recognize all of the surrounding realities that inform our producers' paradigm, that shift and alter their management practices in the way that they do. And until we address our economy, until we address our health and our well-being of our communities, we're not going to be able to have that monumental stride in the opposite direction of reclaiming lands and revitalizing and even enhancing the remaining grasslands that we have. And so just really want to echo the sentiments that were shared with my colleagues. And, we can do this. This is not an impossible feat, but it is going to require collaboration, and it's going to require an eyes wide open approach to holistically addressing this system.
Well, thank you all. It's really been emphasized that our land health and our people and our communities go hand in hand. So we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each one of you, I'm going to start with Clint, then Marshall, then Kelsey. Give me your last 1 minute summary of the future for grasslands and what brings you hope. So Clint.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy.
Clint, your hotspot's given us a challenge. I'm going to go to Marshall and Kelsey, and we'll try to circle back and see if you're better connection. So Marshall.
Well, I think it's really appreciate Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and the partners that have brought this together today.
As moving forward and listening to others and listening to.
Go ahead, Marshall.
I just want to thank the partners that have brought this together. This is what gives me hope. When people get together, they refine and grow and share their knowledge, and then we go from here and we share this knowledge and this passion and this commitment with others. That's the way that we're going to really raise the amount of awareness that we need to make the difference that we need to make in this, what I like to call a very decisive decade. This is, and we always hear that about every election is so important and every decade is decisive, but this one more than most. We're at a real tipping point. As I alluded to earlier, 17% of the Amazon has been lost, 22% is considered the breaking point. By some accounts, with invasive species and loss, we've blown past our grassland tipping point, or we're close to it. And so the action needed has to be dramatic, unprecedented. And I'm really buoyed by the things that are in front of us, whether it's the North American Grasslands Conservation Act or other programs and projects that have the type of scale that can make the difference that we need. So I'm optimistic first and foremost because people like you all care. That's what gives me optimism.
Thank you, Marshall. Kelsey?
Yeah, echoing Marshall's sentiments. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this conversation together. you can feel the energy, even though we're on Zoom. You can feel the energy and the excitement in this space. And I think that it's important that these conversations continue to happen in as diverse of settings as possible. We need to be able to make them as accessible as possible, whether that be remote and virtual in the time of COVID chapter 4, or if that is in person, if it's at our high schools, if it's at our elementary schools. One of my most favorite activities that I get to do every year is I travel to a local school, very small school, less than 200 students, K through 12. And I get to take the 3rd and 4th graders out on a plant walk, and getting them out onto the landscape, picking some dandelions, showing them the different medicinal plants that grow on our landscape, and getting into the soil and seeing the energy and excitement and that reawakening of the connection with the land happen in our youth is super inspiring and uplifting. And if any one of us could, or every one of us could start to figure out ways to stimulate some of those experiences happening within our own communities, within our own youth, at our own schools, then we're really going to start to inform the individuals who are going to have to take on what's to come in the next decade. And because there's going to be another decade, this is the decade of decision, but there's going to be another decade, and we need to make sure that they're just as informed and hopefully more informed than the decision makers in this one.
Thank you, Kelsey. Clint, are you back? Can you give us your last minute, 60-second pause for hope?
I hope so. Can you hear me better, Tammy?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you. What I was starting to say was, I think what Kelsey mentioned earlier, and Marshall as well, is that importance of collaboration. You know, as we continue to build partnerships and relationships, not just within this conservation community, but with non-traditional partners and folks across other aspects of industry, whether it's the food industry, the education industry, you know, reaching out to our schools, our colleges and universities, so that we can help bring that next generation on board and help bring that excitement and energy to their minds, as well as to the importance of conserving our grasslands and conserving our overall ecosystems out here across the landscape. So I'm excited for the future. Every time I get to talk to folks like yourself and other conservation partners, we're all like-minded, we're all looking to the future. And the main thing is, I think as long as we come to the table open-minded, willing to listen and willing to change, right? I think that's one of those most important aspects, is not only just listening, but being willing to make those changes that we need to make to reach a broader audience. We almost need to, on every one of these Zoom calls or in-person meetings, once we can start doing that again, we almost need to challenge everybody to bring a friend, you know, bring your banker, bring your insurance agent, bring your you know, your doctor, whomever, get them to come to the table and listen to what we're talking about and help get that message out there to where they're thinking about it when they go buy a product at the grocery store, whether it be steak or hamburger or chicken or whatever, that they're thinking about the importance of the overall grassland ecology and where that came from, and the folks out there stewarding those lands to keep that sustainable. So thanks again, Tammy, for the opportunity to be a part of the panel today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Kelsey, Marshall, and Clint. Your passion, your expertise are just contagious. We really appreciate you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please go to www.grasslandsroadmap.org. You can actually see some of the communication tools that we're pulling together, including Grasslands and You poster and information. And just so you know, a follow-up survey will be coming. Please take it, fill it out, and help inform our future conversations. So I hope you learned a lot more about our grasslands. Please stay tuned, stay engaged, and get out and enjoy those beautiful landscapes and the communities. Thank you so much.